Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the August 22nd, 2022 special City Council meeting, Troy City Council meeting. I'll call the meeting to order and ask for a roll call for Ms. Dixon.
Mayor Baker?
Here.
Councilmember Abraham?
Here.
Councilmember Brooks?
Here.
Councilmember Chamberlain Kringa?
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Erickson Galt? Here. Councilmember Hamilton?
Here.
Councilmember Hoderick?
Here.
All present this evening. First up on the agenda is public comment. I don't see anybody is here for public comment this evening, so we'll move on to business stated in the special meeting notice. We have one item this evening, D1, City of Troy Expenditures. I will turn it over to City Manager Miller.
Thank you, Mayor and members of council. As the mayor just said, this meeting is to talk about the trends over the last 20 years of our expenditures. And what I think is also important to note that although we have not scheduled any additional study meetings, we can. At this point, I believe only the mayor has submitted a question. And the question was in general about if we were to cover capital expenditures through another means, how much money would that free up? And there's actually a number of ways we could look at that, but that's not what this meeting is here for today. This is really to talk about expenditures. And then when this is over, I guess as council, you'll have to think about whether or not you want an additional study meeting to talk about this, talk about any other questions that you may have or other areas that you would like us to dwell into a little bit more. And then the process after this is to go to the advance on November 19th. Is that the right date?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I once made a mistake with it and freaked out Aileen. But, we can talk a little bit more about the advance as we go forward. Bob and I have a kickoff meeting coming up. We're about ready to schedule it with James Petrino. With that, I'll drop it off to you, Bob, and you can get going.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, everybody, for being here tonight, coming out early again. Before we talk about expenditures tonight, I want to give a brief plug for the survey. The survey was in mailboxes last week, and this week we're encouraging people who didn't receive it in the mail to go online and take it. And you can take it with the code TROY. If you received the survey in the mail, there's a special code just for you because you're a part of the sample. For non-sample survey takers, you just enter the word TROY as the code. And so we're posting about that on the website and social media and so forth. So, and this is, as Mark was talking about, this is all part of a process leading up to the advance in November. And I believe council has 2 other special meetings scheduled. So at the end of tonight's meeting, we can talk about whether or not you want to keep those and how we might use that time. But last week we talked about revenues. Tonight we're going to talk about expenditures. So the goal is to provide a high-level overview of both the City of Troy's experiences and trends specifically, and then how that compares to some other communities. And the challenge is to avoid jargon and try to use normal English words that everybody will recognize, and to stay out of the weeds. This is really kind of big picture. And I think it's worth noting that unlike the federal government, the city can't spend money it doesn't have. So expenditures are constrained by revenue. We talked a lot about revenue last week. Can't spend more money than we bring in. So what you're going to see in these trends is how city councils have reallocated portions of the pie over time, but only voters can actually increase the pie or order a larger pie, as they did when the library millage was initially approved 11, 12 years ago, and then increased in 2020.
Bob, I'm going to interrupt really quick. The one thing that I really noticed in looking at the early versions of this is that you really cannot compare communities apples to apples. Just understand that everyone is a little bit different, nuances. They have a library district, or the county does their police services, or in our case, we have a volunteer fire department. Novi has a paid-on-call fire department. So everyone has a little bit of different nuances in how they deliver services.
So this is how Troy has spent its money on average from the period 2003 to 2012. Last week we were able to talk about a 20-year period This week, we're stuck with 2003 because that was a year the city changed its accounting. So if you look in the back of our annual financial report, there's a statistical section that has a lot of numbers and trends over 10 years and so forth, which is unaudited. But it's a really convenient way to collect some data and look at like, oh, okay, what's happened over the course of the last 10 years. And in this case, we're able to go back to 2003 and look at the expenditures and come up with an average, kind of like what we did with revenues last week. This is the average of our governmental expenses. Governmental expenses includes the general fund, but not just the general fund, also capital improvements, streets, things like that. It's easier to say what's not a governmental fund, and what's not governmental fund are enterprise funds like golf courses, water, sewer, that sort of thing. So this is not general fund specific, but includes all the governmental funds. And so you see the biggest pieces of the pie are public safety, public works, recreation, culture, and general government. And so
it's important to know public safety includes police, fire, and building department.
So we're going to talk about those pieces of the pie from smallest to largest. And so this is Troy's recreation and culture expenses from 2003 to 2021. The overall trend line is negative, trending down, but you'll see that, you know, in the mid-2000s things were trending up, and then the Great Recession comes along, things are trending down. Once upon a time, you know, in the mid-2000s, things like the Nature Center and the Historic Village were city operations staffed by city employees on the city's books. Those are now, you know, managed by the Historical Society and the Nature Society. They're not on the city's books anymore. And then you can kind of see a second little bump where expenses start to increase through 2015, 16, 17, up through 18 and 19. And I think the dip in 20 and 21 is probably COVID related, because especially with recreation, culture, and that sort of thing, the community center was shut down. There wasn't a lot going on, and that's not because the city council didn't adopt budgets that invested in it. It just was we couldn't spend the money because the world.
And a lot of that is paid for service. You know,
right.
Fees for recreation.
Bob, just to, like last week, these are actual dollars, not adjusted for anything, right? So really, in reality, the line would be very different.
Absolutely not adjusted for inflation, just nominal dollars. So general government expenses, this is primarily things that happen here at City Hall. You know, have to have elections, have to have a finance department to collect the revenue and to pay the employees and all that kind of fun stuff. And here, the shape is a little different, but overall downward trend over that period of time. Public works relatively flat over this period of time, few peaks and valleys, but instead of kind of following the economy, this is more following what kind of projects were going on.
I just had a brainstorm. 2007, wasn't that one of the coldest and snowiest winters?
2014.
Because when we sit and look at these, we always try to wonder why they're little anomalies.
Yeah, we didn't chase those down, but every once in a while something will occur to us like, oh yeah, that's what would happen that year.
We were flush with cash before the recession hit.
Yeah. And this is public safety expenses, and I have to thank Rob, because this afternoon we were going through a draft of this presentation, and there was some kind of anomaly in 2004 where spending was like down near 16 million instead of 26 million, and Rob figured out that was an error in that unaudited portion of the city's financial report where I got the data from. So we were able to update that and correct it. So again, overall trend a little bit negative, but you can kind of follow the pre-recession, things were moving up, recession, expenses go down, post-recession, things are moving up. more recently, expenses going down. Haven't delved into this, but off the top of our heads, we think the fact that we have a lot of vacancies in the police department is part of the reason that expenses have fallen off, because we budget for full employment. But, we haven't actually, I think we have something like 13 vacancies in the police department right now. There was once upon a time where we were at full employment. It might have been 2015. Haven't looked to verify that, but that's part of the cause for those trends. So this is total governmental expenses over the same period of time, and you basically see the same trend. Negative overall with kind of two humps corresponding with pre-recession, post-recession. So now let's look at some comparisons. Last week I compared Troy to 3 different groups of communities. This week I condensed it down to one group of comparison. So there's 12 communities, including Troy, in this group, and most of them they're all cities that we talked about last week. So again, we're going to talk about governmental expenses in ascending order, starting with recreation and culture. And now this is adjusted per capita, whereas when we're looking at the Troy expenses, we're just looking at dollars. So in 2004, unfortunately, Bloomfield Township couldn't really get the recreation and culture data out of their financial statements. You'll see a few different places where the column's blank, and that's just because different organizations report things differently. But among the communities that we do have data for, in 2004 the average was $100 per person. Troy was at $155 per person, so that's 55% above the average at that time. By 2021, Troy is basically right next to the average. Mark kind of mentioned that it's difficult to do apples and apples. What we're really looking for here is kind of overall movement during this time of period. But Farmington Hills has a district library, which is a separate authority. So Farmington Hills Recreation and Culture number doesn't include their library the way Troy or Novi or most of these other communities are, because with the district library, it's a separate government entity. General government expenditures per capita. This is an interesting one. 2004, Troy's below the average of 137. 2021, Troy's below the average of 131. But look what happened there. The average actually went down. We all did such a good job of reducing general government expenditures over this period of time that Troy's went down $5 per capita and the average went down $6 per capita. And part of that was to help reallocate resources towards public safety. Public Works, 2004, averaged 157 per capita. Troy's a little bit below the average there at 92. And then in 2001, the average is $254. Troy's down at $77 per capita. But Royal Oak is building a new municipal center down. There's a lot of stuff going on in Royal Oak in this particular year. So I made one more chart to take Royal Oak off, leave it out of the average, and it drops the average from 254 down to 216, and St. Clair Shores swaps places, basically going above average. But overall, the effect of that kind of high level of spending in Royal Oak doesn't change much. And now public safety, the biggest piece of the pie in 2004, Troy's right there near the average at $325. And then by 2021, we're about 20% below the average. at $406. But you can see here, you know, the average grew from 335 to 503. So while other areas of city township spending are flat or being reduced, public safety spending is growing and becoming a bigger portion of the pie. Total governmental expenditures per capita, again, it's all the government stuff rolled together. 2004, Troy's above the average at $1,228 per capita. By 2021, it's below the average at $988 per capita. Rochester Hills is lower, but as we talked about last week, Rochester Hills doesn't have a sanitation fund. So that's one of the kind of interesting, just one example of some of the differences here. The other thing too, we'll go back, talk about public safety for a minute. Look on the right, Southfield, Dearborn, Bloomfield Township, Warren, Royal Oak, full-time fire departments, full-time police departments. Look at the other end of the spectrum, Rochester Hills, County Sheriff's Office, and full-time fire department. Novi, like Mark mentioned earlier, paid on-call fire, full-time police. I don't have anything to say about Farmington Hills off the top of my head, but obviously here in Troy we've got full-time police and volunteer fire department. So that's part of what accounts for the difference in the spending per capita. Okay, so overall conclusions, negative trends in Troy between 2003 and 2021 in recreation, culture, general government, public safety, and total governmental spending. Now, those trends, you know, include two different kind of humps. Negative, red, that's not a judgment, that's not qualitative, that's simply quantitative. That's the direction that spending went. And public works spending was basically flat. Same thing with our comparison to other communities. General government spending basically flat. Was kind of strange in that the average went down. A lot of pressure on general government spending. When we look at recreation and culture compared to the other communities, Troy went from being above the average to below the average for many of the reasons we talked about, basically contracting out management of the village and the nature center. And then public safety spending and public works spending, Troy started out below the average in 2004 and fell further below the average by 2021. And again, it's not a judgment call, merely directional in terms of the math. So with that, I'll try to answer any questions you may have.
Thanks, Bob. Appreciate that. Last week we started with Ann, so we're going to start with Edna today and go this way. So we'll start with Edna and then we'll see where we go. Quick presentation. Feel free to pass if you're. Yeah. Come back. We always come back.
You're good. Just curious. 2012 was kind of when the Great Recession impacts were truly being realized. And a lot of the cuts were personnel. That's always the biggest expenditure. Clearly, we didn't audit other cities' books, but did the trends that we saw in Troy, are they pretty consistent or typical of what was in the region? Because trying to put the two halves of the picture together, last week we talked about revenue, this week we're talking about expenditures. Mm-hmm. It may be that we're not spending as much because we're not taking in as much revenue because some of the cities that we saw on that list, they did raise their millage rates and increase their revenue. So they can spend more because they have more.
Right.
That said, is the two humped charts that we're seeing consistently, is that similar to what other communities who haven't raised us? Maybe I should just stop there. Is
Yeah.
it similar?
So if we collected 2003 through 2021 data for all 12 communities, I think the shape of 2003 to 2011 and 12 probably be pretty consistent for all those. What happens after that depends on the tax rate and whether or not voters approve new taxes. So when was Troy's first library millage approved?
2012.
2012.
2011.
Okay. So you see revenues obviously spike in 2014. So I'm not sure how much, or this is expenses too, because first you have to collect the revenue and
Before
then
you can
you can spend it. So, so obviously, with that tax increase, the library tax increase, Troy was then able to spend more. So I think that's your results are going to vary in the post-recession years depending on how many and how what kind of tax increases occurred in the community.
Well, what is interesting to me is that, the Great Recession was around '08 actually. Well, there was then a 2-year delay before it hit us in the way that we collect taxes. But you can see that all the cuts were made here, but we were still falling. And I think there was just it was just, we were being really cheap day to day. And I think that's what happened. But I think part of your question is what were the other communities doing? What did you do at Ferndale when you were city manager during Great Recession? You cut and cut, right?
Well, yeah, we cut, and voters approved a heavily override shortly after I left.
Which was what year?
2011. And, so we, that we can go back and look at, tax rates and that sort of thing and show what happened in these communities if that's of interest. But to answer your question, the shape of the pre-recession is probably going to be pretty similar across communities. What happens post-recession depends on whether or not voters approve tax increases.
Yeah, and I'm not asking for a new science project,
Okay.
by the way. But it is, it's now we're seeing the fuller picture with the revenues and expenditures. Like you said, unlike the federal government, we can't spend what we don't have, and we're not going to spend, our rainy day fund to pay for operational costs. We got to be prudent in how and when and how much. That's all I have for now.
Thanks, Ed.
When we look at the expenses and when, as City Manager Miller put it, we were being very cheap. That was also a time frame when using the rainy day fund was something we were concerned about, as I'm recalling, in terms of its impact, not to use jargon, but its impact on our AAA bond rating. To lean on that was going to maybe cause us to lose that asset of our AAA bond rating. So as I recall, the prioritization of where we were spending, we had to be mindful of what that looked like so that we could keep protecting our AAA bond rating along the way. Do we know, how many other communities were struggling with that? Had a bond rating they were trying to protect, and if they had a charter that made it even dicier to do that protecting. Were we the only community in that place, and are we still having to be mindful of that, is my question.
Off the top of my head, Oakland County and Bloomfield Township
In Birmingham.
and Birmingham have AAA bond ratings.
Yeah, so I can tell you what each community spent on principal and interest payments over this period of time, but it can't.
It's hard to know that, right? Because it's like a historical, ongoing decision-making process. It's not necessarily in the numbers. Yeah.
Yeah, and even if we looked, I mean, because there are some years where communities deficit spend, on purpose, because they're trying to spend on fund balance and that sort of thing. So even looking at that, I don't think that would really tell us anything.
Okay.
I know the county dipped into the rainy day fund during that period. I'm positive they did.
So I have a little more comments. So the cuts were made when I came to the manager's office right through here. Then we realized the cuts as the previous city manager came in. And then the previous city manager had all the cuts laid out from him. We had a considerable amount of general fund balance. So this probably was a lot of, remember Troy Road's Rock and all that, which was a lot of fund balance being spent. Not necessarily day-to-day running of the city. We were just spending a lot of fund balance that had built up.
Yeah, and capital improvements,
Yes.
right?
Okay.
Because those are governmental expenses, the road funds, capital improvement funds.
And then, so these years were bleeding off the fund balance on roads.
Hey, Mark.
Yeah.
Yeah, so what happened, like you said, in 2013, we actually overcut. The
Yeah.
fund balance got really big, and
Yeah.
then we were able to start spending it again.
I guess
That's exactly what happened.
And are we still in a position, though, going forward of having to be mindful when we prioritize spending, of keeping that in mind? Because does that charter amendment and that change in terms of the millage cap still is that still a factor in what we need to be considering and when we prioritize our spending?
Well, everybody has a millage cap of one sort or another, whether it's a Headley maximum or something up. We're kind of unique in that the charter maximum. So that's going to dictate how much revenue. Again, it goes back to the millage question. Has millages been increased to allow a community to collect more revenue and then spend more? But the charter amendment is a revenue limitation like any other revenue limitation.
Well, I'm not sure if you asked this question, but I think we're going to go into it. Bob and I just had a conversation beforehand. We were looking at the charter. And although we have a general fund millage and a capital fund millage, and we apply the Headley rollbacks to the capital millage, it doesn't specifically dictate in the charter the exact amounts of those two millages. I think my experience, and Lori, you've been around longer than I, it's just been a way of practice of splitting it up. And then the capital fund gets hit by Headley and gets rolled back, and not the general fund.
Okay.
Mark, what are you telling us with that? Sorry, I understand everything you said, but I don't understand everything you just said. I just don't know why you said that now, I guess.
Well, why I said it is that it's interesting in that, one, the chart, we have both a capital and a general fund millage, but yet it isn't specifically identified in the charter that way, but we apply it that way. And then we apply the rollbacks only to the capital, not the general fund.
Yeah, I guess another way to put it is that's a self-imposed limitation that's done by practice, not by charter.
Go ahead.
What I was going to say is, when the city was being built, it was split 5 and 5. There was 5 mills for capital, 5 mills for operating. Then, as the city's built out, you don't need as much capital. So then you're hiring more people to run the city, more police, more fire, more everything. So then you need more millage to run it. So we moved it up to 6.5. As far as I've gone back, it's people in my position have always recommended to the councils 6.5 is the mills that we're keeping. We need that 6.5 to run our general fund. But why I'm comfortable keeping it at 6.5 is when we do have extra money, we then transfer it into the capital fund as part of the budget. So it's a little more leeway.
And over the more recent years, we contribute from the general fund, this is kind of related to your question, from the general fund to the capital fund, either $1 or $2 million a year.
Correct.
Approximately. And if things got tough, that's the first thing we might have to think about doing to help out. Take away from the capital fund is that contributions from the general fund back to the general fund.
It's like-
That's kind of why I mentioned is that there's this little interplay that there's a sub, it's kind of, you kind of have to know the history of the city, why it exists.
Gotcha. Emily, did you have more?
No, thank you. That's a good conversation, thank you.
Gotcha.
Just a quick question about the fund balance. How does the fund balance kind of play into this picture? Because it's not considered an expense, is it, or is it?
No, I mean, the fund balance is like the rainy day
Right.
fund, the depending on, it's characterized different ways. So, and the city has a fund balance policy that, we want fund balance to be between X and Y % of operations. And so as Mark and Rob were talking about, there was a point in 2014 where, and in 15, where the city council at that time said, hey, we've got too much money in the fund balance, we need to spend it. Fund balance is a one-time revenue source. Once you spend it, it's gone forever, so you generally spend it on one-time expenses like capital improvements, things like roads. So
My memory is right, it was up around $50 million, the fund balance, if my memory's right.
yeah.
And so it's really what you don't spend, it clicks over into fund balance
Automatically.
after June 1st, yeah.
Right.
Rob, did you want to add anything to that?
No, that's perfect,
Okay.
yeah.
So you don't really budget for the fund balance? It just kind of what you don't spend goes into?
Rob has started to do it,
Yeah,
yes,
so-
he has.
So, right, so we do. So when we have, let's say, we're getting over we have a rule to say we can't have over 30% of our expenditures in fund balance. When we're at, say, 35%, then when we prepare the budget for you guys to approve, we actually have more expenditures drawing down the fund balance, so we're within our parameters of the fund balance rule of nothing more than 30%.
Rob, can you comment on how I hate to use this word, it's a bad word, burning down fund balance in the capital fund?
Right, so when I've worked with the heavy hitters, Bill Goodery and Dennis and Kurt, all the...
Pete too.
What's that?
Pete too.
Pete, yeah. When we have all these big expenditures for capital, we have the facilities assessment study, right? It's really easy when we go to look at it and we say, they come in and say, we want to spend all this in the year 2023, and it's like, we don't have enough money. But we're purposely drawing the capital balance down because we have all these needs. And so we're going from 16 down to 12, down to 8. Something in the council agenda tonight will potentially draw it down more. It's like, and we're purposely doing that because eventually, whatever decisions you guys make long term, we can't go to the public and say, we need more money for capital if we have this huge $30 million fund balance, right? So we're slowly whittling that away.
What percentage are we at right now? Do you know? I can't remember from the last budget. Like, where are we in that
For
assignment?
general fund
Yeah,
balance,
yeah.
we were over our 30%
Still
threshold.
over our 30%.
Yeah. What's that?
So we've been over our 30% for as long, I think, as we've been on
Right.
council.
And-
Yeah.
Yeah, what happened there, remember we had that CARES Act money that came in at $4 million, and then the 13 police officers that were short or whatever, that's a built-in $2 to $2.5 million a year that returns to the fund balance because we're not spending money.
And then one other quick question. I think I know the answer to it, but overall, has the number of employees for Troy dropped? Because, I mean, obviously if our expenses are gone down, but the cost of living, wages has all gone up significantly, and personnel is one of our biggest expenses. I'm assuming that obviously the number of personnel has gone down.
Yeah, there was a big cut for the Great Recession in that 2009, 2010, there was considerable. I actually was providing overall management, building, planning, and I had to cut their budgets 40%. So
Yeah.
most of that was people.
The employment data is in the statistical section of the financial report. So I have the data, but I didn't make the chart. If I made the chart, it'd probably the curves would probably be pretty similar to what you see here.
And to add to that, there was a significant hit in the police department, and we had incentives. So that saved a lot of money because the new employees made less money and they also had less expensive benefit packages.
And one other thing on that, because we've had great stock market return over the last decade until just recently, if you look at about 2017, 2018 on, we have less pension payments, pension contributions that we make to the fund, so there's no pension expense the last 4 or 5 years, and our retiree healthcare funding has, at least in the time I've been here, in the short time, we used to contribute over $5 million a year, and it's down to 3.2. And I know, David, you know those numbers quite well too. So there's $3 million baked in of legacy cost savings right in those last 3 or 4 years as well.
So if the market goes bad, the general fund might have to make contributions to these retirement type programs.
Right.
They might. And in the Great Recession, I think the retirement contribution went up to like $2.5 million, I believe. And now, and we've been at zero for what, 5, 6, 7, 8 years?
Yeah.
Yeah.
4 or 5 years, yeah.
And we've never gotten back to those levels, right, as far as our employment?
No, the numbers, no, we have not gotten back to them, and we can get that information for you if you want.
And we've done different things, so like, I don't, Bill, you might be able to speak to this, right? Like, how many engineers did you once have on staff?
Yeah.
And then how many do you have now?
Yeah, when we were at our highest level, we had 30 staff. We had 23 full-time, 7 part-time, and we have 12. So
Kurt,
that's
know
why you
any
see a
numbers?
larger number for consultants.
You know any numbers off the top of your head?
Yeah, grounds alone, full-time and seasonal staff, we were about 65, and we're less than 20 now.
So, and that's another thing that makes kind of comparisons tricky over time is that, you know, engineering staff has decreased, use of outside engineers has gone up. You know, once upon a time, the building department was insourced, it was outsourced. Now it's going to be insourced again. So the FTE chart is interesting, but you know there's you know nuances that won't capture either.
Right.
All right, Rebecca?
So the thing that I'm struck by is around public safety. It's always the biggest thing that we spend our money on, but it's interesting to see over time that is the thing that has suffered or is suffering. And I want to unpack it because I don't know, is it partly because we don't have to pay our firefighters in a sense? We have volunteer firefighters. Is it, because if I look at it vis-a-vis other cities, and an example is I have an argument going with a colleague at work from Sterling Heights, which is better, Troy or Sterling Heights. And I say, okay, Troy, you know, we just passed a budget of 180 million. She's like, oh, our budget is 240 million or something. I'm like, oh, but you had to pay your firefighters. We have an amazing volunteer fire force. And so I don't know if that's just, so I was surprised even where they follow, because I know they don't outsource their EMT, that's paid in-house. I thought those numbers would be even higher from ours, but is it just, that's how when it's adjusted for per capita,
Yeah.
that's what you get, because there's such a larger city.
Yeah.
Sterling Heights has grown into a really big city in the state of Michigan.
They're like 50% more people than us.
Yeah, it's a lot. Okay, so that kind of explains
It's a
what
much
that
more
is.
dense city, because they actually have a lot of industrial areas too.
But is ours driven down by, is the nature of the volunteer fire force that's kind of built in? And secondly, just not, we have these open positions, or how? Can you just kind of unpack it a little bit more?
It's all those things. I don't think it's any one thing.
Hey, Bob.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, on you ask about the fire, right? Our volunteer model today versus, let's say, Sterling Heights. If we were going to go to Sterling Heights' model, when I've talked to Mark about this in the past, I've always said, oh, we would have to raise our 3 mills. We would have to go from approximately 10 mills to 13 mills just to have that full-time fire department for 125 men and women to be there full-time 24/7, 7 days a week with the EMS, et cetera. That's just my high-level calculation. I haven't dove in that deep, but it's approximately 3 mils. And then the other thing is, each year, you were asking about public safety. Right now, we have the whole time I've been here, the 3 years, we've always been short at least 10 police officers. Again, that's a couple $1 million right there. We're not the only community though. Most communities are short police and fire right now versus their budgets.
Okay, that's helpful.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, my question was kind of along the same line, and it's probably not something we can answer tonight, but just to kind of put more reality to these numbers. Like, what does it mean that Southfield spends over $700 per capita on public safety versus our 406? Is that more police officers? Do they have faster, slower response times? It's just a different area that has a different level of crime too. So I'm just curious on how that looks. And when it comes to recreation and culture, I know a lot of other communities have, like Rochester Hills, have very elaborate parks and things like that, or Farmington Hills and other areas like that. So I kind of want to get a sense of what that looks like. And you also mentioned legacy costs and debt. Like, I know our legacy costs and debt are very low compared to everyone. So how much of it is that versus, less services than other communities are experiencing? It'd be interesting to deep dive on that.
David, you mentioned, Bob had mentioned this when we were meeting earlier, but if you look at that chart right there, public safety, the far right, Southfield, Dearborn, forget Bloomfield for a second, and Warren, those three border Detroit, okay? I can tell you, working in Warren versus Sterling Heights, we compared our two cities all the time. When we have to police 8 Mile versus they have to police 14 Mile, which is Warren's best side, like, it's night and day that we had so many more officers than Sterling Heights.
Right.
So that would give you an example of why they're going to have more officers than Troy.
Mm-hmm. I think that's it for me.
Well, with that being said, when we had to cut the police department after the Great Recession, the police department didn't like it. They didn't want it. They had to do it.
Yeah. And to residents, I would imagine that looked like slower response times, more
There was
dangerous traffic, because less
officers
traffic
on the road,
enforcement. Yeah,
basically,
that's right.
So, first, have you put these slides on the web, or are you going to provide those to us so that we can?
Yes, is the clerk's office posted it? Yeah, it was posted on the website late this afternoon.
Okay, great. I thought when you were showing the difference in the expenditures from '04 to '21, it would be really interesting to compare that side to side or superimpose with the revenues.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's hard, we're listening to you and kind of guessing, why did 2015 spike up? Because we had to spend down from the fund balance. So it's kind of like an incomplete picture just looking at the expenditures without knowing how much money was coming in the door and being able to look at things. For instance, what my original thought before you were talking about the fund balance was 2014, and I was thinking, well, maybe that's when the federal foreclosure crisis relief program started kicking in, and maybe foreclosures, went down. But just in terms of understanding revenues versus expenditures, it would be helpful to have those two together. When you were mentioning that we had a negative trend in spending, you were talking about the per capita versus other communities, not like our actual dollars, because I'm pretty sure it shows that, for instance, public safety, obviously we're spending a lot more in '21 than we were spending in '04.
Yeah, the snapshot in time between '04 and '21, except in the case of for general government, which actually did go down, most of the spending went up in real dollars. The reason that some of these trend lines are the way they are is because there's two different things happening. There's kind of the pre-recession, post-recession, and Yeah, pre and post. So don't read too much into the trend line. You know, you can make that trend line, you know, point up or down just depending on what time period you're looking at. So I guess don't overemphasize that. I included it on this because when you look at that shape, to me anyway, it just kind of begs the question. It's like, okay, well, overall that period of time, what was happening? Does that answer your question?
Well, I kind of was, in the later slide, you talk about us having a negative trend.
Mm-hmm.
My question is is negative trend in actual dollars spent versus negative trend in our per capita spending versus other communities?
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, this is the negative trend that I'm talking about.
Okay.
In Troy's recreation and culture, general government, again, public works relatively flat, public safety a little bit negative, and total government negative. In the so that's what I'm talking about here in the Troy trends. What I'm talking about here is where we ranked in comparison, and we talked about whether these should be up or down arrows or side to side arrows, because like if we look total government 2004, Troy's on the right side of the chart. 2011 it moves to the left, which means it was moving down relative to the other communities. So that's
flat. The spending was about the same.
Right. So that's what this is relative to the average. We're flat in general government. We fell from above the average to below the average in recreational culture. And then in public safety and public works, we started below the average and fell further below the average. And again, it's quantitative, not qualitative. Part of it is because we have super duper efficient service delivery, not that it's, bad or cheap.
Apples and oranges.
Yeah. But still, though, we're talking about the same set of communities over a period of time. So it's that movement that, should make us stop and scratch our heads and wonder, well, why is that? Why isn't the 2004 and the 2021, why aren't all the communities ranked exactly the same? Something happened in that period of time to change those ranks.
So I can give you an example which will kind of explain how we got rid of a service in the Great Recession, but it may not necessarily impact the city per se. We used to have animal control officers.
I was just going to bring
And the animal control, you would call up and say, my cat or dog perished. They would come and pick it up and then take it to the Oakland County, which is where they would incinerate the carcass. And we found out that it was legal to double bag that carcass and put it in the garbage. So therefore, we eliminated that service, that cost, but does that really make the city less a desirable place to live? I mean, as an example. There are a lot of different examples.
Oakland County Animal Control leaves a lot to be desired.
Well,
Just double bag it, Ann.
Well, and that's
Tag my beloved pet.
Don't let your
I
kids
drove
say.
through a snowstorm to take a cat to
And that's where things like the resident surveys come into play. Say, okay, this is the level of spending we're at today. How satisfied are people with the service at that level of spending? Because there's no right or wrong. There's no magic number that, we need to spend $25.72 per resident on service X.
Because what we're talking about is not, we have our minimum needs met. We have adequate public safety, we have, in most categories, our minimum needs are met, except perhaps capital expenditures, which is a whole nother ball of wax. What we're talking about is, do we have adequate quality of life to make our residents happy and content living in Troy versus living in Sterling Heights or some other place that may have more amenities that make people happier?
Right.
I spend way too much time at next door, as everybody knows. And what I continually hear is Troy being compared to Sterling Heights or other communities, Rochester Hills are the two main comparisons because they're right next door. And people are comparing amenities side by side and saying, Rochester Hills has this, why doesn't Troy have this? You know, Sterling Heights has this, why doesn't Troy have this? And so what we're talking about isn't about whether we're providing a minimum quality of life for everybody here. It's whether it's an adequate, you know, whether it is a, you know, it's what our residents want and what they want us to invest in.
And I think there's you'll see a difference in the opinions expressed on Nextdoor versus what you'll see in the survey.
Oh, I would hope so.
Yeah.
Well,
So-
and I think that might be an apple to oranges. Doesn't Rochester Hills rely on another entity for recreation?
yeah.
Yep, and Older Persons Commission?
Right. There's
Yeah,
there's
so
a
the city doesn't
dedicated.
provide those services, other authority does.
It has a dedicated revenue
Yeah.
source. Yeah.
I think that's all my questions.
I have a million, but they're not appropriate for this meeting, I don't think. My mind is going crazy because I'm also looking at other meetings we have scheduled, whether or not we need them. If you don't have a presentation, do we really need them, right? I have a lot of questions about stuff like, well, how much would it cost to fix the aquatic center and City Hall and talk about tennis courts and that kind of stuff, right? And where we're at with the facilities assessment, like how much money we've invested into that. I don't know if those are things that can be addressed in the future or how we look at that, but this to me was interesting, but it doesn't give me much, like it didn't satiate me as far as anything, because I think it's missing the comparison of where the money came from, what we spent. Also, like, great that Southfield spends so much on public safety. I like Troy, what Troy's got going on so much better, right? So it doesn't compare, right? I really struggle with that. The slide for public safety actually kind of concerns me, the number 9, I know it's number 9, because I just want to make sure the negative trends and all those, where that dip over the past couple of years, that really is not how we budgeted it. We've actually been increasing our budget for public safety. I want the public to understand that, and our police, obviously. And I don't want that to get out look like, well, there's been a big drop off in public safety prioritizing by the city, because that's not the case at all. So it is because of 13 employees or 13 missing, right? Ellen?
Well, and related, if somebody's looking at the budget and we have a budget for police officers at this level and we're only spending this, there was a time when there was a pressure and an argument to just drop the budget, to not, and we need to have it in the budget for those positions because we want those positions filled and we want the money there to be there for filling those positions. So just
Right,
somewhat related, this can come at us in different ways. Either we'll get feedback we're not spending enough, or it's in the budget and you don't spend it, so maybe you don't need it in the budget. Yes, we do need it in the budget.
We do need it.
Well, we are spending more raw money. It's like also our population is going up, especially with the new census. So that's kind of brought the per capita
Right, it
down.
just frustrated me to see both that it says
Right.
public safety is negative trending and to have that actual graph. I mean, if someone's just looking at what was posted online, they're gonna think, oh, this council isn't prioritizing public
Right.
safety, and that's not the case at all.
And
So
as
I-
Rob said, I think that's also the huge drop in legacy costs too, since public safety is like half our workforce.
For sure.
So
It bothers me, and I know it's
I
not the
understand.
case, because I know we've consistently added things and done everything we can to keep that really the number one priority in the city in our budget. So I just want to make sure that's
Well, and
as
it-
clear as possible.
Yeah, agree. And you see that in the reductions in spending in other areas to keep public safety the bigger portion of the pie. So yeah, don't get too caught up on the specific trend line. Like I said, that's covering a period where there's a lot happening. It's just kind of one more data point. There's no smoking gun here that is telling city council, oh, you should be doing X, Y, Z or A, B, or C.
Yeah, and I'm not getting hung up on it. I just don't want anyone seeing it to get hung up on it, because I think it would be a misrepresentation of, it lacks maybe it's the slide lacks the perspective, all the other qualitative stuff that you're talking about, which you've talked about. I just want to, so that one probably more than anything. The other thing I think is, I mentioned, I ticked off a couple of those things that how much it would cost to do this. For me, 3 years in, I'm ready to get some of those numbers, and I don't know how we get to that point. I don't know what the advance, like what do we want to do with the aquatic center? We can talk about all, and I know we're all, maybe I'm putting the cart before the horse in a sense, but we're maybe this is that background stuff that we're doing to get there. I guess from Mark, your standpoint, if we don't have any more meetings about this stuff, I don't want to show up at the advance and, I hit you with a bunch of how much will it cost to do this? Can we look at doing something like this? But I don't know if we need a meeting to talk about that kind of stuff. I don't know if council even wants to do that, right? So that's recognizing that. It seems to me that people complain the most in the city right now about recreation a little bit when it comes to services that are lacking, whether that's from a senior standpoint or what's going on, not specifically with that. No offense to Brian or anything at the community center. I just mean people are wondering why don't we have more of these things, right? So to me, it seems like we do need to kind of focus in on what we can do there with that kind of stuff. I don't know what council's expectation is of where we go next and how that works with the city management's thoughts are. So I think that's kind of where we're at, right? Like, what are we doing next, and what do we need to think about? What are you thinking about? And that goes to, I think, where you started with, we have these 2 other meetings scheduled, but we don't really have anything yet for them. Do we need them, right?
Yeah, well, I'll answer that question this way. I have enough of what I think is interesting stuff that's on the cutting room floor that, if we came back in 3 weeks and had another meeting, would be able to give you some more interesting things to look at, and also to try to, bring together the revenue and expenditures in one place. But I think what would be equally as important is, city, like, you didn't get to see this presentation in advance, and, apologize for there's really tight turnaround on this presentation, but, go home, digest it. If you have questions related to revenues or expenditures and can email them up to us, then, we can start to collect data and hopefully answer some of those questions if we meet again in 3 weeks. And you mentioned the advance. There's a certain amount of, kind of baseline financial stuff we wanted to get out of the way before we get into the advance, which is, the advance is really kind of intended to, talk about prioritization and that sort of stuff. And as Mark mentioned, we'll have a kickoff meeting with James probably this Friday. And if you remember from last year, the way the advance was developed is that the facilitators interviewed council members and staff. James is going to interview council members. We cut back on the hours to interview staff this time around. But it's basically whatever input you provide to James, he's going to come back to us, and we're going to start to develop that agenda for that advance. So it's all part of the same process, and I can't, I appreciate what you're saying. Like, you don't want to show up in the advance and ask, super specific questions. We need to know those things in advance, and so that's really what we're kind of.
Advance of the advance.
Yeah.
When do we expect results to come in from the survey?
October,
right before. So I hope that you appreciate, council, that we weren't trying to presuppose anything going into these meetings. So, and I'm trying to dance around this. If you want us to research anything to go to these study meetings, this is the time to ask us, or, we have 3 weeks so you can think about it. Mm-hmm. And so this is the first time I'm going to say this. So do you want us to research and give you the facts on other types of revenue generating methods? Is that what you would like or not? We don't know what you want. And we talk about further, we can go a little bit further in some of this analysis, but we're really trying to take a real neutral standpoint and not tell you what to do exactly, and try to help you develop what you want to do.
But I
That
think-
makes sense.
Yeah, and I think it would be helpful to have the survey results.
Yeah.
Before we spend too much time on revenue options, because the survey results are gonna tell us, what voters are thinking. And so we can tailor that research based on that. And I think there will be enough time between when we receive results in October and the advanced meeting in November, to be able to give you some, fairly detailed information about what options might look like.
Okay, yeah, thanks, man. Yeah, my thing is with the revenue is ultimately that's up to voters.
Right.
So to me, that's like the voters' concern. And I agree with a lot with what the mayor said. Like my concern is what could we be spending on that would be really valuable for the community and how much would that be? I know the facilities stuff is probably the biggest need right now. To get a dollar amounts, which I know with inflation and everything, it's hard to pin it down, but just like kind of an estimate of how much that would be to really get our facilities where we want them to be. And then we could get into more detail on public safety and everything else and what we could be spending on it if it had a dedicated revenue source and questions like that are where I'd like to see this. I like this though to get a perspective on where the other communities have gone the last 20 years and where we have comparatively, I think is very valuable. And it showed, and if you add inflation to this, we've gone way down compared to our neighboring communities, so it's good to know.
Kurt, can I ask you a question? You're being put on the spot just a little bit. Dennis, how long do you think we're gonna, until we need to redo the facilities study? I mean, are we getting through it? Is it getting old?
So that was, we're getting to a point, I would say another couple of years, we should start considering re-engaging that process to relook at the facilities. Because obviously the facilities age, we're definitely not keeping up with the plan suggested. So it would be time to relook at it and reprioritize in a couple of years.
The economy's changed too.
So yeah, I do think it would be valuable to have maybe one more meeting just to have that kind of discussion, because I think it is important to get that info before the advance.
Well, and also, it's hard for all of us to remember what the 5-6 year capital plan says, what's off in the future.
Mm-hmm.
And I know let's take cricket pitch has been in the capital plan, but every year it gets pushed off another year. So just to see what's in those down the road that's not actually in the budget would be good also to see, I think, for all of us.
Yeah.
Kind of look at.
I think there's enough nodding heads to stick with September 12th.
Yeah, it's 3 weeks, so there's lots of time.
And we're a little after 7, we probably should wrap this one up and not focus on too many more questions, but emailing questions to both of you, I think would be wise. I know I sent a couple that weren't really appropriate for this meeting, but maybe they are for next, or do with them as you see fit. But I encourage all of you to email any questions you have, because it'll make a better meeting and better advance.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. Ellen?
When we were talking about what we spent on roads from our fund balance, I was on council at the time, and I think members of the public are very grateful that we prioritized the roads back then and did what we did. And I guess because we're in a study session, I don't want to lose sight of, there was very serious prioritization of that fund balance. A mindfulness of a policy where we shouldn't be over 30%, we shouldn't go below 20. And because there had been really solid fiscal decision-making, our roads, I don't know if you recall, people were getting flat tires and they were county roads. And the county didn't have the funds to do what we needed to do yesterday. We were catching up with disintegrating roads. And one of the things I think this community collectively can be proud of is that we did prioritize roads, and I get comments on that a lot. I'm really glad. And you know what they notice? They might not talk about it on next door when they make comparisons, but you do get conversations of, wow, I can really tell when I cross the line into X city, and I don't want to malign any other city. But it is about prioritizing and using that fund balance and having it. no one was anticipating that those roads were going to start disintegrating. They were cratering. So I just wanted to give a perspective of, yes, we did a huge bump in spending then, and correct me if I'm wrong on my memory on that, where's the roads guys? But that was a full court press in partnership with the county to make that happen. And this is what we're talking about, is how do we prioritize what we have? We can't overspend. So what are the priorities? And I think it is good to meet again.
And then to say, what could we be if the residents don't want it?
If they wanted it.
Yeah, and it's their choice in the end.
It's their choice.
But it's our choice to put it before them.
Correct.
That's why we need to do it.
Yeah,
Honestly,
absolutely.
that's the thing. So, okay. So I think you have some direction from us, right? All right. There's no other business stated, so I'm gonna adjourn.
Break.